Every legal encounter leaves a trace. Every strict investigation pursues honesty. Comprehending your legal rights, establishing true justice.
Step back from the victim. Hands where I can see them. Officer, I am Dr. Isaiah Carter, emergency physician. I need to maintain pressure until EMS arrives. Step back now. Let the paramedics handle this. I am emergency medicine. This patient is in shock with major blood loss.
It was 1:52 in the afternoon on an October day when the body camera captured that face looking up. A black man in a gray t-shirt, kneeling on the asphalt beside a wrecked car, hands occupied, doing what he had been trained for over a decade to do. The smile on his face was not one of joy. It was the involuntary, tense smile that certain people develop over a lifetime as an automatic response to situations where danger comes from an unexpected direction. He had stopped his car because there had been an accident. He had run out because there was a victim who needed help. And now there was a police camera pointed down at him while he tried, simultaneously, to keep a child alive and process the fact that the officers who had just arrived at the scene were not looking at him like a first responder. They were looking at him like a suspect. What happened that afternoon on a busy roadside was recorded in detail by the body camera the officer wore on his chest. And that video would become in the weeks that followed the center of a storm that hit the department in ways its leadership was still trying to contain months later. Not because the video showed explicit violence or dramatic physical confrontation, but because it showed something that in certain ways is harder to defend than violence. It showed the logic of an approach that had no justification beyond the appearance of the person being approached, and that logic was recorded with date, time, and enough clarity to leave no room for alternative interpretation. The man kneeling on the asphalt was named Dr. Marcus Webb. He was 38 years old that October afternoon, had spent the last 12 years of his professional life in one of the busiest hospitals in the state, and held the position of chief of the emergency medicine department, which meant he was, by definition and by training, exactly the kind of person you want present when there is an accident victim in immediate need of care. He had seen the impact happen in his rearview mirror while driving. He had braked, pulled over, and moved toward the wrecked vehicle before any other driver nearby had fully processed what had happened. There was a child in the back seat. There was an unconscious woman in the driver's seat. And there was Marcus, with his knees on the asphalt, doing what he knew how to do better than anyone else on that stretch of road at that specific moment. The patrol car arrived 4 minutes later. That detail matters because 4 minutes, in the context of physical trauma and unconscious victims, is a significant amount of time. Marcus had used every one of those 4 minutes. He had assessed the driver's condition, had stabilized the child's position, had checked vital signs with the methodical precision of someone who does this in packed emergency rooms at 3 a.m. When the officers arrived and saw the scene, what was in front of them was a black man kneeling beside a wrecked car with his hands on a victim. That was the image they processed, and the conclusion they drew from that image would reveal, in the days and weeks that followed, something about how certain types of assumptions function in practice when they have authority and a weapon behind them. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome. What this story reveals goes far beyond a police error on a roadside, and every section that follows deepens something you will want to understand completely. Hit subscribe right now and tell me in the comments, have you ever tried to help someone and been misread for it? Tell me down below. The body camera kept recording as everything unfolded on that asphalt that October afternoon. It recorded the moment the officers arrived. It recorded the approach. It recorded what happened when Marcus tried to explain who he was and what he was doing. And it recorded, with a clarity that no verbal version of the story could fully replicate, the moment the situation went completely out of control in a way that would cost at least one person everything they had built over years of service. The doctor who had stopped to save a life was about to be treated as though he were the threat. Marcus had arrived at that stretch of road by chance, the way most things that change the trajectory of a life arrive, without warning and with no apparent logic beyond timing. He had left the hospital earlier than usual that afternoon because a private consultation scheduled for that morning had run longer than expected and had shifted his entire schedule for the rest of the day. He was driving in a state of functional fatigue, the kind that emergency physicians develop as a default operating mode after years of irregular shifts, when the impact happened less than 50 meters ahead of him. The sound was sharp and immediate. The car in front of him lost control, collided with the side guardrail, and stopped at an angle partially blocking the right lane. Marcus's training was not the kind that shuts off when you remove your white coat. 12 years in an emergency department create reflexes that function independently of context, of the clothes you are wearing, or of the fact that you were technically off duty that afternoon. He pulled his car onto the shoulder with the same automatic efficiency with which he would have responded to a code inside the hospital, stepped out of the vehicle, and moved toward the accident before he had consciously decided to do so. When he reached the wrecked car, what he found was a situation that any emergency physician would immediately recognize as critical but manageable. The driver was unconscious but breathing, with a visible cut on her head and signs of possible cervical trauma that made any unassisted movement potentially dangerous. The child in the back seat was conscious, frightened, and apparently without serious physical injuries, but in a state of shock that required immediate containment. Marcus worked with what he had. There was no equipment, no team, no resources that transform an emergency room into a controllable environment. There was him, the asphalt, and two human beings who needed help right now. He stabilized this driver's head with his own hands to prevent uncontrolled cervical movement, assessed her breathing, checked her pulse, and began speaking to the child in the specific tone that emergency professionals use to keep conscious patients in shock, anchored in immediate reality. Other drivers had stopped. Someone was calling 911. And Marcus was kneeling on that asphalt, doing what he had dedicated his professional life to doing, with no thought beyond keeping those two people stable until adequate support arrived. The first officer to arrive was named Officer Doyle. He had 7 years of service, had responded to dozens of accident calls, and had developed over that time a mental scene assessment protocol that, like all mental protocols, was only as good as the premises he had internalized over the course of his career. When Doyle arrived and took in the scene, he made an assessment. There was a wrecked car. There was an apparently unconscious victim. And there was a black man kneeling beside her with his hands on her body. That assessment lasted approximately 3 seconds and produced a conclusion that no objective element of the scene justified, but that the body camera would capture in sufficient detail to be analyzed frame by frame weeks later in a conference room by attorneys who knew exactly what they were looking for. Doyle approached Marcus with his hand at his waist, not at his vest or badge, but at his waist, and ordered him to step away from the victim and show his hands. Marcus heard this and did what anyone in his position with his level of training would do. He tried to explain the situation immediately, because moving his hands from where they were at that specific moment could result in uncontrolled cervical movement of the driver that could significantly worsen her condition. He said he was a doctor, said he was stabilizing the victim, said that removing his hands now could worsen her condition. Said all of this in perhaps 10 seconds, clearly and directly, with his gaze divided between the victim and the officer, because he could not give full attention to either without compromising the other. Doyle did not process any of that information in the way it was offered. What he processed was that he had given an order and it had not been immediately followed. And in that gap between the order and compliance, in a window of time the body camera would record as less than 15 seconds, he made a decision that the subsequent investigation would classify as not only unnecessary, but as the direct origin of everything that became impossible to undo afterward. He called for backup, describing the situation on the radio as an uncooperative individual at an accident scene with possible criminal involvement. That description, transmitted over the radio and recorded in the system, set the tone for how every additional agent who arrived at that scene would process what they found. Not as a doctor providing aid, as a suspect who had resisted an order. Backup arrived in less than 6 minutes. 2 additional patrol cars, 3 officers, all briefed over the radio with the description Doyle had transmitted. They arrived with the posture of people called to a risk situation, not to an accident scene where a healthcare professional was providing aid. That distinction between what was actually happening and what had been communicated over the radio was the chasm over which the entire subsequent sequence of events would be constructed. Marcus was still kneeling on the asphalt when the 2 patrol cars stopped. He had managed, in the minutes between Doyle's arrival and the arrival of backup, to keep the driver stabilized and the child calm enough not to worsen her own state of shock. He was doing the work. And then there were 4 officers around him with a completely different narrative about what that scene meant. The second officer to interact directly with Marcus was an agent named Torres. He was more experienced than Doyle, had undergone additional crisis situation training, and arrived at the scene with that specific energy of someone who had been informed there was resistance and arrived prepared to find it. When Torres approached and assessed the situation with his own eyes, something in that picture should have created a pause. There was a man kneeling with his hands in a position clearly consistent with medical stabilization, not aggression. There was a child nearby who was being kept calm in a clearly intentional and trained manner. There were other drivers stopped around who were observing the scene without any sign of alarm regarding the kneeling man. None of those elements was sufficient to create the necessary pause. Torres ordered Marcus to stand up and identify himself. Marcus responded that he was a doctor, that he was stabilizing a victim with suspected cervical trauma, and that he needed one of the officers to take over the position of his hands before he could move safely. That request was medically precise and operationally reasonable. It was exactly the kind of transition that paramedics and field physicians routinely make when there is a need to transfer stabilization responsibility from one professional to another. But Torres had no medical training and was not processing that scene as a care transfer. He was processing it as continued disobedience. And when Marcus did not stand up immediately after the second order, Torres signaled to the other agents and the situation escalated in a window of time the body camera would record as less than 20 seconds. Marcus was forcibly removed from his position. His hands were pulled away from the driver abruptly, exactly the kind of movement he had been trying to prevent from the beginning. Doyle's camera captured the moment the driver's head moved in an uncontrolled manner when the support of Marcus's hands was removed. That specific moment, which lasted perhaps 2 seconds in the recording, would become one of the central points in the forensic medical assessment that would be requested weeks later as part of the legal process. Because the question was not only what had been done to Marcus, it was also what had been done to the victim at the moment when the only qualified medical support present at the scene was forcibly removed by people who did not understand what they were interrupting. Marcus was placed on his knees on the asphalt with his hands behind his back while the officers tried to process the situation. It is at this moment that the body camera captures the image that would come to visually define all subsequent coverage of the case. Marcus looking up with that tense and involuntary smile, on his knees on the asphalt, with the officers surrounding him and the victim he had been treating visible in the background. He had asked to see the agent's identification, had repeated that he was a doctor, had calmly asked whether anyone present had sufficient medical training to assume care of the driver. Each of those interactions was being recorded, and the composure with which Marcus conducted them, kneeling on the asphalt with his hands handcuffed behind his back, was the kind of detail that experienced attorneys recognize as the behavior of someone who understands that the camera is the only ally available in that moment. The ambulance arrived 4 minutes after Marcus had been removed from the victim. The paramedics who stepped out of the vehicle assessed the scene quickly, and one of them, a professional with more than 15 years of experience, immediately identified that the driver's position had been altered in an uncontrolled manner at some recent point. He asked who had been treating the victim before their arrival. One of the officers pointed to Marcus, who was still kneeling on the asphalt in handcuffs. The paramedic looked at Marcus, looked at the officer, and asked a question that no one present could answer satisfactorily. Why the only medical professional at the scene had been immobilized instead of being incorporated into the care effort. The silence that followed that question was being recorded by Doyle's body camera, and that silence would be as eloquent as any word spoken that afternoon. Marcus was released at the scene approximately 22 minutes after having been handcuffed. The decision to release him did not come from a genuine reassessment of the situation by the agents present. It came from the moment when one of the paramedics, frustrated by the lack of clinical information about the driver's condition, asked Marcus directly about the vital signs he had recorded before being removed from the victim. That conversation, conducted with Marcus still on his knees on the asphalt, with his hands cuffed behind his back, had been recorded by Torres's camera. And what it showed was something that anyone with any understanding of emergency medicine would immediately recognize. Marcus providing, with absolute clinical precision and without any hesitation, a complete assessment of the victim's condition that was exactly the kind of information that only exists in the mind of someone with advanced medical training who had been physically present conducting assessments in the preceding minutes. The senior paramedic listened to that assessment, looked at the nearest officer, and said something in a low voice that the body camera captured with enough clarity to be transcribed later. He said that man had just given him more useful clinical information than anything the officers present had managed to preserve from the scene, and that if that information was accurate, and his experience told him it was, the decision to remove that man from the victim had potentially complicated the treatment in a significant way. It was not a formal accusation. It was a professional observation made in a tone that left little room for alternative interpretation, and it was recorded. Marcus was released from the handcuffs with no formal explanation, no apology, and no acknowledgement that what had happened in the last 22 minutes had been a mistake. One of the officers returned the belongings that had been removed from Marcus's pockets during the approach, including his car keys, his phone, and his wallet. Inside the wallet was the hospital badge with Marcus's photo, his title printed below the photo, and the name of the department he led. The officer who returned the wallet opened it, saw the badge, and Doyle's camera captured the expression that crossed his face at that moment. There was no way to know with certainty what was going through his mind, but there was a way to see, with enough clarity to be described in detail by anyone watching the video, that something had shifted in how he was processing the situation. Marcus collected his belongings, walked to his car still parked on the shoulder, and sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes before leaving. That part was not on the officer's body cameras, but there was a traffic camera on the pole above that stretch of road that had been recording the exterior of the scene since the moment of the accident. That camera captured Marcus getting into his car, and then captured something that no one in the subsequent investigation had expected to find. He got out of the car again, walked back to the paramedics, and spent another 6 minutes talking with them about the driver's condition and providing additional guidance on the management of the cervical trauma that had potentially been aggravated during his forced removal. He had just been handcuffed for 22 minutes without justification, and the first thing he did when released was go back to work. That image, captured by the traffic camera and not by the officer's body cameras, would become the second most important visual piece of the case after Doyle's camera. It showed with a clarity that transcended any verbal argument what Marcus had been at that scene from the very first second. A professional doing his job, even after having been treated as a criminal for doing it. When the attorneys who took on the case saw that second video for the first time, the assessment was immediate. Those two recordings together, the body camera showing the approach, and the traffic camera showing Marcus returning to help after being released, told a story so complete and so unambiguous that the only relevant strategic question was deciding how to present it as effectively as possible. Marcus arrived home that night with his pants torn at the knees from the asphalt, and a clarity about what he was going to do next that he would later describe as the only mental state available when you have spent 22 minutes handcuffed on a roadside for having tried to save a life. He was not angry, at least not in the way anger normally manifests. He had a cold and methodical determination that came from understanding, with the precision of a professional who spends his life making decisions in crisis situations, that what had happened that afternoon had not been a random error. It had been the result of specific assumptions that had an identifiable logic, and that logic needed to be exposed with enough evidence that it could not be dismissed as a misunderstanding or coincidence. He had the cameras, he had the recordings, and he had, as he would later say himself, absolutely nothing to lose by demanding that every second of it be examined in the light of day. The lawsuit was constructed over 6 weeks with a methodology that reflected the profile of the person behind it. Marcus had not hired the first available attorney, nor had he acted driven by the emotional urgency of someone who wants a quick response to a recent injustice. He had researched, consulted colleagues with experience in civil suits against police departments, and chosen a firm with a specific track record in cases of abuse of authority with video evidence. The choice was not random. It was part of a strategy that began with the premise that the case did not need to be constructed because the evidence was already all there. What needed to be done was to ensure that evidence was presented in a legal context that made it impossible for the department to use the standard defenses that normally protect agents in situations like this one. The firm obtained the recordings through formal requests, filed the same week it was retained. Doyle's body camera, Torres's camera, and the municipal traffic camera that had captured Marcus returning to help the paramedics after being released. Those 3 files were analyzed together and separately, with synchronized timestamps to create a precise timeline of every second of those 22 minutes. The analysis revealed details that were not perceptible in a casual viewing, but that became significant when examined frame by frame. The angle of Marcus's hands over the victim, which any emergency medicine professional would immediately recognize as cervical stabilization's positioning and not as an aggressive posture. The distance he maintained from the victim's body, consistent with clinical assessment. The way he had positioned his own body in relation to the child in the back seat, creating a physical barrier that any pediatric trauma specialist would identify as a deliberate shock containment technique. Experts were retained to technically document each of those elements. An emergency physician with academic credentials and experience in forensic testimony produced a 43-page report analyzing Marcus's behavior in the videos and concluding with precise technical language that closed each possible counter-argument, that every action he had taken from the moment he arrived at the wrecked vehicle to the moment he was forcibly removed was consistent with field emergency medical protocol and inconsistent with any behavior that would justify police intervention. A second expert, with a background in behavioral analysis in crisis situations, produced a separate report on the agent's approach, documenting the specific points where alternative decisions were available and were not taken. The lawsuit named Doyle and Torres individually, the shift supervisor who had received the radio communication and had not intervened to correct the narrative before it escalated, and the department as an institution. The central allegations included unlawful detention, unnecessary use of force, interference with emergency rescue services, and civil rights violations with documentable racial motivation. That last allegation was the most technically complex to prove, but also the most important, because it was the one that transformed the case from an isolated operational error into a systemic issue with implications that went beyond those specific agents. The attorney's strategy was to build the simpler allegations with irrefutable evidence, and use that solid foundation to support the more complex allegation, with the accumulated weight of everything established before it. The department initially responded with the standard communiqué about an ongoing internal investigation and commitment to transparency, the kind of institutional language designed to sound responsive without admitting anything. But there was a complication that made the waiting strategy far more difficult to sustain than in previous cases. Marcus was not anonymous. He was chief of the emergency medicine department of a known hospital with public visibility, with colleagues who had begun to speak out, and with a story that news outlets had immediately recognized as the kind of narrative that resonates because it combines two elements that rarely appear so clearly documented together: the injustice of what had been done and the inescapable irony of to whom it had been done. A doctor who saves lives being treated as a threat for saving a life. There was no way to frame that favorably for the department. Media coverage began before the lawsuit was officially filed, fed by sources close to the case and by the recordings themselves that had begun circulating in medical and legal communities. When the lawsuit was finally filed and the details became public record, the reaction was immediate and broad. Medical organizations issued solidarity statements. Emergency medicine associations published declarations about the risks that healthcare professionals face when they attempt to provide aid in public spaces, without the institutional recognition they should have. And the video of Marcus looking up with that tense smile, kneeling on the asphalt, with dirty pants and hands handcuffed behind his back, became the image of something that went far beyond an incident on a roadside on an October afternoon. It was the image of a system that had failed in a documented, precise, and impossible to ignore way. The department announced the results of its internal investigation on a Monday morning, 3.5 months after that October afternoon. The document was 17 pages long and concluded, in language carefully constructed to appear self-critical without being devastating, that the agents involved had made decisions that were not aligned with scene assessment protocols, and that the department recognized the need to review approach procedures in situations involving civilians providing aid. It was the kind of conclusion that serves to close an internal investigation without truly holding anyone accountable, the kind of document that exists to be cited as evidence of institutional good faith in settlement negotiations. Marcus's attorneys read the 17 pages in under an hour and sent the department a 2-sentence response, informing them that the internal investigation did not alter any aspect of the federal lawsuit, and that settlement negotiations, if the department had any interest in exploring them, would need to begin with a far more direct acknowledgement of what had happened on that roadside. The negotiations were long and at several points genuinely uncertain. The department had experienced attorneys and had, like every public institution with sufficient resources, the capacity to make a legal process costly and prolonged enough that the opposing party might consider accepting less than they deserved, simply out of exhaustion. But Marcus was not the kind of person who yields out of exhaustion. He was the kind of person who had spent 22 minutes kneeling on a roadside, with his hands handcuffed behind his back, and then gone back to help the paramedics when released. Exhaustion was not a variable the department's attorneys could use as leverage in those negotiations, and they discovered that progressively each time they tried an approach that depended on wearing down the other side's determination. Doyle was dismissed 4 months after the Burt incident, after the internal investigation concluded that his initial radio description of the situation had been inaccurate in a way that had directly contributed to the subsequent escalation. Torres was dismissed 2 weeks later, after depositions revealed contradictions between his version of events and what the cameras showed at multiple specific points along the timeline. The shift supervisor who had received Doyle's communication and had not intervened received a 90-day suspension without pay and was demoted, a consequence that Marcus's attorneys had argued was insufficient, but that the final agreement ultimately accepted regarding that specific individual after securing additional conditions that made any recurrence extraordinarily costly from a disciplinary standpoint. The financial settlement was substantial. The exact figures were kept confidential by a negotiated clause, but sources close to the proceedings indicated that the amount reflected not only the immediate harm caused to Marcus, but also the department's assessment of the risk it would have faced in a public trial with those 2 recordings as central evidence. The agreement also included a set of institutional conditions that Marcus had insisted be as specific and verifiable as possible, because he had seen enough of how institutions respond to public pressure to know that vague promises of change rarely survive the moment that pressure subsides. The conditions included revised mandatory training on recognizing and interacting with healthcare professionals at accident scenes, with documented periodic evaluation. They included the creation of a specific protocol for situations where civilians with medical training are providing aid when police arrive, and they included the incorporation of Marcus's case, with all its details, into the training material for new agents. Marcus held a press conference the day the agreement was announced. He appeared in white hospital coat with his name and title, embroidered on the left pocket, and spoke for 12 minutes with the direct precision of someone who had thought carefully about every word before saying it. He said he had not fought for money, although the money was a fair consequence of what had been done. He had fought because the driver who was in the wrecked car that afternoon had survived without permanent damage, and a small but real part of that was due to the fact that there had been a doctor present in the first minutes. And he had fought because he wanted the next time a doctor or a nurse or an off-duty paramedic stopped at an accident and got out of their car to help, the first response of the agents who arrived at the scene to be to ask what that person needed and not to treat them as a threat. That was the change he wanted, and that was the change the agreement had attempted, within its limits, to begin creating. There is one final image that matters in this story, and it comes from none of the cameras. It comes from an account that the driver of the wrecked car gave to a local newspaper 6 weeks after the incident, when she had recovered enough to speak about what had happened. She said the last thing she had perceived before losing consciousness in that car was a voice, a calm voice, close by, that kept talking to her even when she could no longer respond. She had not seen the face of whoever was speaking, had not known the name. She only found out afterward when she watched the video, like everyone else. But she said that voice had been the reason she had managed not to completely panic in the seconds before she lost consciousness, and that waking up in the hospital without permanent damage was something she attributed, at least in part, to those 4 minutes in which a man she had never seen before had decided to stop his car and do the only thing he knew how to do, better than anyone else on that stretch of road at that moment. The cameras recorded everything, but that part, the part that mattered most, was not in any recording.
Truth is a continuous pursuit, and awareness is your best defense. Thank you for watching and championing global transparency.